dear everyone, welcome to our second podcast about divine names and all the good stuff. We have to notice that this podcast is financed by the John Templeton Foundation.
Yeah, I would call it supported. It's nice word for the same thing.
Supported. But all the opinions, of course, expressed here are ours only and does not
reflect their
stance. I would also ask our dear PI, which is not private investigator but primary investigator.
Sometimes these two are the same, it depends.
To tell us a little bit about the project and actually no, we should have presented ourselves first. I'm Irakli. I'm researcher in the Institute of
Smooth.
And I'm also organizing all this podcast and other good stuff. This is our private investigator, Miloš.
Yeah.
And
your personal philosopher.
And of course our dear friend, also researcher in the project, or what's your researcher, Martin Vacek. And please, Mr. Private Investigator.
Okay, the analogy is actually quite good because sometimes you are working in the shadows of thoughts, ideas, arguments. You have to check on the others, what they are doing, when they said, what they said, how it, how they written it. So it's actually kind of close to investigation. And yeah, some arguments out there are a crime, so that should be solved. Nevertheless, the project, I will be brief because if you want to watch or hear more about the project, please check the link below or whatever. I assume we will provide. But in a brief sentences, we are what we call analytic philosophers. We do analysis of people's arguments, thoughts, presumptions, usually based on some logic in behind. And we kind of check on disagreements between people because that's kind of places where people argue. And one of the biggest disagreements, as we discussed the last time, is the disagreement between theism and atheism. And maybe the question what they disagree about. And usually we noticed that not only we, but also we noticed that usually they use statements, sentences which contain some names which are kind of strange because they look like names like Martin, Miloš, Irakli, but probably are not names of people like God, Zeus or Vishnu, you name it. You can put here your famous or favorite god, the god. So we kind of looked at this. And lately, the last time, we were discussing expressivist positions, which our colleague Mirko Sambrota is investigating more. And today, I'm glad we can show your a bit of, let's call it metaphysicians. The prime example of Slovak metaphysician Martin Vacek. Actually, for me, he is the one on which Slovak metaphysics is based for past 15 years. I don't know.
It's because it's the only one.
Yeah, that's not that hard to do.
He was not making a compliment. He was just stating facts.
Yeah. So, nevertheless, he has some unique positions, unique view, unique background, and I would like to hear from him what he brings to the project, how he deals with it, and please, Martin, what do you do?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me for the podcast. So first of all, I should probably note that I'm not really talking about God in order not to do any blasphemy or whatever. So whatever I say is what I think might play the God role rather than the God itself. So my question is, what the entity we usually associate with God should be like. So the problem is like this: we all talk about God, But when we ask what God is and what's the main features of God, we face a lot of problems. So although we do use God all the time, after a deeper analysis, we find out many problematic features of the God. One of the main problems I'm interested in is that we associate many properties with God which are internally inconsistent. So the problem is that everything what God is, if there is a God, should instantiate the so-called grade-making properties, right? So we want
Great mating.
grade-making
Okay.
properties. So we want God to be omnipotent. We want God to be omniscient. We want God to be omnibenevolent, and all the great properties we usually attribute to God, we want God to instantiate. When you think about it, it raises many problems because, let's have an example. God could create a stone which no one could lift. If God can create the stone, he should be able to lift it. But he creates a stone which no one can lift. Therefore, we have inconsistency in one of the grade-making properties. So probably God is not able to create a lift which no one can lift. But then that goes against his omnipotence. So the problem is how to analyze those properties. We have people who say this is not really a problem for God because God is interested in what's possible, right? So if it's impossible to create a stone which no one can lift, this is irrelevant to attribute those properties to God because God is interested in everything what's possible, and God ignores what's impossible. Other people say, well, we should really take those properties or those grade-making properties for granted. And what God or God-like entity in fact does is that, yes, he does an impossible thing. So he does create a stone which no one can lift, but at the same time he can lift the stone.
Can I jump here? I'm just wondering if you are using philosophically heavy terms, and I don't know if already now or will be going there down the road. So if you are speaking now possible, impossible, you are just speaking common sense arguments. You are not, or are you already making technical jargon?
No, I just think that everything what's contradictory is impossible. So it's not possible that it's raining and it's not raining at the same time. So by now, impossible means to be contradictory or inconsistent or something what cannot happen. So some people say that, look, probably there are some truth even about impossible things. So probably it's true that God creates a stone which no one can lift, but it's also true that God can lift the stone. These people say that the so-called the law of non-contradiction, namely the law which says that there are no true contradictory statements which are true together, is simply false. And these people say that God simply can make impossible things. Other people say that, look, it's not true and it's not even false that God can create a stone which no one can lift. These people say that some propositions, namely the propositions about God and his grade-making properties, are neither true or false. They don't have true values.
Is it like a fiction, or is it just like a negative statement? They say what the statements about God are not. Do they say what they are?
That these statements have no truth value.
Okay,
right? So they are neither true nor false. So, in contrary to people who say that these statements about God are true and are false at the same time, these people say that they are neither true nor false at the same time. And my contribution to the debate is to bite the bullet here and simply say that, yes, we usually attribute those grade-making properties to God. And it's even right to attribute those grade-making properties in God. But I don't think that change the logic might change the story here. So my argument against people who say that it's true as well as it's false is that changing the logic can go step by step, and at the very end of the row, we'll get no logic at all. So here is an example. So suppose you say that it's true and it's false at the same time, that God can create a stone which no one can lift. These people say that the law of non-contradiction does not hold here. That simply means that we can have true contradictory statements which do not imply everything. So in classic logic, that means that usually when we say that something is true and false at the same time, anything follows.
Yeah, that's the biggest sin.
Exactly. So people who say that people who advocate a contradictory properties of God simply say that that very rule that goes back to Aristotle, simply does not hold. And the so-called principle of explosion, which exactly says that everything follows from true contradiction, simply does not follow.
Yeah, maybe you could elaborate on this a bit more, because it seems like obvious, yeah, but we mentioned that if you have a contradictory, this is a general, scientists are trying not to make contradictory statements, and this is actually why. Can you elaborate, why is it problem to have a contradiction in your theory, if you are a scientist?
Yeah, I mean, you don't want contradictions, because then to contradict yourself means to say anything at all. So we don't want people to be internally inconsistent. We don't want the world to be internally inconsistent. We want world to obey some laws, and one of the most fundamental laws are supposed to be laws of logic. And one of the most fundamental laws of logic is the law which says that it's not true that something is and it's not the case. So that seems to be kind of the starting point of every debate, that some rules must simply hold without respect of any contingent things happening in the world.
Commonsensically, there has to be facts. In the end, there are facts.
Yeah, there is a hidden supposition that the world is constructed out of facts, whatever the facts are. There is a huge debate what facts are, but we can say as neutral as possible to simply state the law of non-contradiction, which says that it's not the case that some fact does and does not obtain at the same time. And there are people who say that it's not the case.
Yeah, I don't know what's their theory, what's my upbringing as a little kid into logic was that you just don't do contradictions, because then you can't predict, because if you have a theory, you should be able to predict what will happen. If you see these two stones falling from the bridge, you can say they will fall in, I don't know how many seconds. In logics, the analogy, if you have these kind of presuppositions or assumptions, you can use the logic to say the consequence must hold. And you can also say that something does not hold. But if you have a contradiction, then you can say always everything, and it's like going to astrology. I want a proper prediction. It's not prediction if my question to you is what will happen, and your answer is everything. That's actually not a theory. That's exact absence of it. So this is actually, from my point of view, why contradiction is kind of the cardinal sin to use the language of the theory. But you were on the road to telling us that if we go step by step if we don't use this rule, then we will lose the logic. So
yeah, so the argument behind that conclusion simply is that suppose you simply say that the law of explosion or the law of non-contradiction does not hold. That brings you a result according to which it's at least coherent to talk about grade-making properties, because it's coherent to attribute contradictory properties to God. Because recall, we just drop off the law of non-contradiction. What we get is a sort of paraconsistent logic, which is weaker logic than widely accepted classical logic. And paraconsistent logic says that it's classical logic minus the law of non-contradiction. So what we get in paraconsistent logic is that we can, in a coherent way, talk about inconsistent stuff. Right? So if there are true inconsistencies, it doesn't collapse because those paraconsistent logics can block the explosion. So it's not the case that if something is true and not true, it's not the case that everything follows. All right, the second step is that even if that's the case, we want God to be omnipotent. So recall, God instantiates all the great making properties. One of them is omnipotent. Now, the paraconsistent move says that yes, God can violate the law of non-contradiction because he is omnipotent. Nonetheless, paraconsistent logic still have some rules. It doesn't have the rule of non-contradiction because recall, we just drop off the law of non-contradiction. But in order to be a logic or the logic, it has to have some rules nonetheless. Okay, but you can go one step further, and if God is as omnipotent as you think, he might be able to rule out even the rules which hold of any paraconsistent logic. Say the law of identity. The law of identity says that A is A, so everything is identical to itself. But even this rule is valid in paraconsistent logic. So although paraconsistent logic can provide for true, meaningful contradiction, it has some rules nonetheless, or it has some laws nonetheless. Now the argument goes, all right, but if God is omnipotent, he should be able to violate any law whatsoever. So be it law of logic, law of nature, any kind of law, God should be able to violate. But if that's the case, it brings us to even a weaker logic, which is weaker in a sense that some rules which does hold of paraconsistent logic do not hold. And we can go step by step.
It's a reduction, like
It's kind of reduction where we get no logic at all, because any kind of logic you have, any weak logic with any few principles you have in mind, God, by great making properties and by the definition of God as an omnipotent individual, God should be able to violate the law. So now we reach the deadlock, right? On one side,
it's quite unusual in philosophy.
Yes, exactly. So on one side, we want God to behave in accordance with some very basic, very fundamental rules. On the other side, we want God to be able to violate those God, because if he cannot violate the God, if he cannot violate the laws, he's not omnipotent. So this is the one deadlock which I don't find very persuasive. And that's the problem I have with this approach to God as a way of weakening the
Okay, can I ask you a question? Like, not that I'm completely outside of this line of reasoning, but for me, my friends and people who don't like me tend to ask me, "What do you do as a philosopher?" Like, yeah, you are working in Slovakia Academy of Sciences, but like, why? Like, that's not what you do. And when I'm in the mood to answer properly, I try kind of to tell them that even we have predictions, and even I shall drop the even, we try also to describe, explain, and predict stuff, but like the field of us as analytic philosophers is logics, argumentation, and things connected. So for me, the basic data, or one of the basic data here to explain was we need to explain in a good way, whatever that means, the disagreement between theism and atheism. And now this deadlock seems to be presenting a point you can't actually never say anything properly about God, because whatever you say, he doesn't have to obey. Okay, that's catchy. But I don't think that's so when people argue. Like, when we are arguing, like, it's like when you try to claim like it's all just nonsense. I don't think that people who argue are thinking themselves to be a nonsense. So maybe there's another line of saying that this deadlock position is kind of untenable, or it's not like it's easy way out again to say that no, even let's say put it this way, even if God, whatever that is, doesn't have to obey any kind of rules, which is kind of up for debate, we as the lowlings do debate, and at least our debates have to obey some rules, I assume. So, am I catching the drift of the outcomes?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have taste here, so I would be very interested in her view. But the idea is that actually, we have a data that the discourse about God is, in some sense, meaningful. People go to church, people pray, people discuss God, people want God to do some things. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to understand what's going on in the debate, because on one hand we are told a lot of things about God or God-like entity to avoid the exact concept of God. We do have a lot of data. People talk about God. So my work here is to really do understand what's going on, because apparently the discourse about God is being here for ages.
Yeah.
But what's the diagnosis that on one hand we have a meaningful discourse about God, and on the other hand we do explicitly, sometimes implicitly, but very often explicitly attribute God properties which are inconsistent. And if that's so, that seems to ruin the history of God in the first place, because if all the discourse is just a meaningless or just misunderstanding of what we mean by God, there is something fishy behind it. So
Yeah.
my work here is just, look, I'm just putting some questions on the table. So I was taught God to instantiate grade-making properties. All so far so good, but to understand what's going on, I need to say more. There are two responses to that. One is that, look, probably logic as a field in human reasoning is not the most fundamental way of reasoning about God. Probably this is just begging the question. Probably logic, not to mention the classic logic, is not the tool by which we should be able to grow.
Like we shall not use mathematics to create art or something like that?
I mean, that might be one way of response. That, look, you're creating a reductio ad absurdum argument against God, but you're begging the question because God, it doesn't even make sense to impose any logical boundaries to God. If that's the case, yes, I have to apologize. I just misunderstood the history of religion. Probably I misunderstood what the purpose that God was introduced was. And then I'll just have to say that, of course, I just misunderstood you. Or you might say, yes, logic is a way of tool, but it's not the ultimate tool of analyzing the God. So logic gives us some limits, but God does transcend the limits. So yes, the discourse is meaningful because there is a logical reasoning behind believing in God, but it's not the ultimate explanation of God. And that might be another response. I'll be happy with both of them, but unless someone poses these two responses, I'm just putting questions on the table, how to rationally grasp the notion of God or the concept of God.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask what is basically your stance and what have you, or what results have you reached by now during your research? Like since no one is basically posing these two answers that you just talked about, what is your stance on the topic?
Yeah, so I'm trying to make a compromise here, which might
politician.
Which might seem as I'm gonna provide a modest approach to God, but in fact I'm just testing a very limiting case what the God or what the godlike entity could be. So on one hand, I'm staying rather conservative when it comes to logic. So I'm not trying to change the logic. I just, for the sake of the argument, I do grant you that the classical logic is the logic of God. God is not paraconsistent, logically deviant entity. Let's just suppose God follows classical logic, as people in Middle Ages thought it was the case. But I also take the discourse for granted. That means that I do take for granted that God instantiates some inconsistent properties. So again, those are mentioned implicitly or explicitly in religious writings, and I just take this datum for granted. Now, when you take those two assumptions together, so when you take the validity of classical logic or the validity of classical inference in human reasoning, and at the same time you take for granted that yes, God does instantiate inconsistent properties, what you get is the already mentioned explosion. So what I'm actually doing is I'm investigating an option where you can have both classical logic and you can have both true contradictions. Of course, what you get is the explosion principle, and the conclusion of my hypothesis is that God is an explosive object.
Okay.
So what it means?
Now we're getting somewhere.
That's quite a catchy tune.
To say that God is an explosive object simply means that God makes every single proposition true. Okay.
Now I see the move.
Okay, so now you see the rough sketch what it exactly means to be what I take God to be under the assumption that classical logic is true and some contradictions are true. Suppose that God is an explosive object. That means that God makes every single proposition true. On one hand, you get the result you wanted. You have people who say that God is everything, right? Probably these people don't really analyze what everything means by means of, say, existential quantifier, but we want just God to be like everything, whatever everything is. If you ask me what God is, I'll just tell you it's everything, right? So that view makes, accounts for a thesis that God is everything. That view accounts for desideratum that God instantiate the great-making properties. Because what else should instantiate great-making properties than the entity which is just great to the most comprehensive way. So if you want me to say that God is everything, I'm telling you God is everything. If you tell me what everything means, I'll tell you everything means everything what follows from true contradictions. You might respond, this is trivial. So trivialism is a thesis according to which everything's true. So my view is trivialist, but with a very, very important modification. Trivialism says that everything is true, and it is told about trivialism that trivialism is meaningless thesis, that trivialism doesn't say anything.
I would say it's at least falsified, but go on.
I say that it's on the contrary. Trivialism has a content. Trivialism has a full content, because if you say that everything is the case, you're not saying nothing. You're just saying everything in a very non-trivial way, because trivialism, traditionally understood, simply says you're saying nothing when you say that everything's true. But I think philosophers of religion might just look at that claim from different angle, namely that, look, it is the case that trivialism, that explosion or trivialism says just everything with its full content. And the third reason why I think people might take the route is that I'm just giving you logical proof. This is not only that I kind of pose God as something was everything. The proof is very simple. Let's say classical logic, let's say true contradiction. What you get? You get everything. This is like deductively valid argument for the existence of entity, which which makes every proposition true. This is not something we make up. This is what classical logic tells us, and this is what an assumption, or very, I dare to say, very uncontroversial assumptions about God.
I think this is too far for me. Like philosophically, this kind of painting what's happening when you are using rule of explosion. I don't think I get it, but I can see how, like, and I wouldn't say that I agree what you just said, but maybe I just don't understand. It's really potent, or as you say, explosive, like to unwind. The easiest thing is to dismiss something, especially if you are a philosopher. But let me just check this argument you just had. Like, okay, you have true contradiction because omnipotence. Okay, you have logics. So what your assumption is that you assume that there is the true contradiction. That's your assumption.
That's my assumption.
So from that assumption and the assumption that classical logics do hold, you provide a truth of statement that there is something that instantiates this. But like, even as this poses as what we call a valid argument, that if we assume that all assumptions are true, then also the consequence must be the case. What you also need to provide is arguments for soundness of the rule. So, do you agree? Like, you take on board, I know you stated that you took on board the statement that there are true contradictions. And the easiest way for me to say is no, there aren't. And then it's not, even if it's a valid argument, it's not sound. So you need to sell me this more.
Look, I'm safe here, right? Because one's modus ponens is another's modus tollens.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'm using the so-called modus ponens form of argument, which I just suppose that yes, there are true contradictions, because the holy books just told me that there are true contradictions. On a not even a deep reading of holy books, there simply are true contradictions. So I take this for granted. So I take the argument be sound. But even if the argument is not sound, then I'm having the question, all right, so what do you really mean when you attribute apparently problematic properties of God as omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence is? Because unless you give me some criterion how to consider those properties without assuming their self-inconsistency, I'm very curious to hear this. What I can say, however, is that I'm not kind of doing ad hoc move here, right? So I'm not posing true contradictions because I want to analyze the concept of God. To use something ad hoc is to use it for one purpose and not use it for another purpose. But the problem of true contradictions are not a problem that is internal to talk about God in the first place.
Yep.
So we have the so-called paradoxes, which simply are internally inconsistent. So suppose you have a sentence, I'm lying. Right? This is a very famous example of logical paradox, which says, if it is true that I'm lying, therefore it is false that I'm lying. And it is false, it's true. So paradoxes are not unique to religious discourse, and we face paradoxes even unconsciously. We face paradoxes on a daily basis. So even the presence of paradoxes is just another reason to take true contradictions
When you were
seriously.
talking, I had this other paradox about barber in mind, that it's maybe a little bit more complex than I'm lying,
Yeah.
but with the same result basically.
Yeah.
I guess the barber who cuts the hair of everyone in the village but does not cut.
Yeah.
How's the
Himself.
himself? But this is the whole statement. What's
Yeah, like just let your mind think about the barber. Like, where does he live?
But he does not cut
himself. Yeah. Yeah.
But
So
cuts everyone.
yeah. So does he cut himself or not?
Yeah.
Like.
If he does, he doesn't. If he doesn't, he does.
Like there's like you can made the move which seems to be made by trivialism. Just agree that like this is the case, and try to kind of non-trivially use it in trivialism, or B, say no, that's nonsense. Like there's something fishy. We need to change the way we do. We change the way we think. Like we need to. If the way we are thinking now leads us to these kinds of conclusion, maybe this is not a good way to think. And like, these are nice. Paradoxes are, if you found a paradox, you are, I'm a happy man if I find a paradox. Like, I'm worried about those paradoxes I don't know about, and they are still leading my thoughts. But what interested me really is like, as I know that your background is metaphysics, and when you stated that God is the thing that instantiates all the statements, all the propositions, and the first things that blinked in my head was like, okay, so God is impossible world, or one of them, which is kind of non-trivial statement par excellence. This is like proper base. Like, are you making this kind of claim, or can I rephrase what you just said by this?
Yeah, so let me introduce the framework
Please do.
within which I work. So I work in the framework of the so-called possible worlds. So we usually think about our world as a world which is the case. So, we have plenty of true propositions about this world. So it's true that Bratislava is the capital of Slovakia. It's true that I'm married, and there is infinitely many true propositions about the world. But we also have propositions which we think are partly about this world, but which are true or false, not because or in virtue of how the world is, but how the world could be. So, for example, where the history of Czechoslovakia be different, Prague could be the capital of Slovakia. It is not the case, but we can think, we can reason, we can conceive, or we can even assume that there are some propositions which are true, but not in virtue of how the actual world is, but how the actual world could be. So philosophers, and this is not a new thing, even Leibniz introduced the notion of possible world, which simply says that there is infinitely many possible worlds. So we live in one world which is the case, but there are infinitely many possible worlds which make some model propositions about the actual world true. I take the discourse about God to be about, or the traditional account of God to be about what's actual and what's possible. That's why I think many philosophers of religion really want to restrict God to either to the actual world or to the set of all possible worlds. But my view is that the same reason you have for introducing possible worlds, you have for introducing for the so-called impossible worlds. So, impossible worlds by definition is the way the world could not be. So recall, we want possible worlds because there is infinitely many propositions which are true, but which are not true in virtue of the actual world, but in virtue of the way the actual world could be. But on the other hand, you have infinitely many propositions which are not even false, but they cannot even be true in that sense. So, for example, Bratislava is and is not the capital of Bratislava is a contradictory proposition. But we have propositions like mathematical impossibilities, like 2 + 2 = 5. There exists one square, and you can list infinitely many propositions which are not true in the actual world, but they are not even true in any possible worlds. There are just truths about something else. And if we introduce possible worlds to analyze possibility, a natural move would be to introduce impossible worlds.
This is this realism, yeah? Like you have the same reasons between like.
Yeah, this is kind of an argument from analogy.
Yeah.
So the way we treat possibility, the analogical way should be to treat impossibility. So impossibility happens in some impossible worlds. So the framework I'm working in is composed of the actual world, the possible worlds, and I add impossible world. Now, God as the trivial object is probably not the existing in the actual world, because the actual world is not,
For the sake of argument.
for the sake of the argument, the actual world is not the trivial world in a way that every single proposition would be true of it. It's not even, it doesn't seem to be possible world as well, because if that's possible, that everything is the case, there are some contradictions in it, right? So it's very hard to say that that object could exist in some possible world, because such an object does not represent any way the world could be. Just cannot be the case. And if it cannot be the case, the impossible world strategy tells us that there is an impossible world such that that world instantiate all single propositions.
I have a small question. If God would be existing in one of the possible worlds, then he had to be existing in all of the possible worlds. No?
That's not a small question.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to. Probably that's a secret, but that's the conclusion of my book. What I really think God is. So far we
Don't
know,
spoil it.
so far we know that God should have something to do with impossible worlds. I didn't tell you what impossible worlds are. So far,
Yeah.
those are kind of theoretical postulates. Any theory has to have some postulates. So I do postulate impossible world.
Like you can't. The normal old staffers, logicians, like are not winning here because the possible world is just an assumption. You can't.
Yeah.
You can't test it. You can use it for other testing. So you can't like put them on microscope and see. Yeah, I can see all the possible worlds. Like this can't happen. So if anybody would say no, possible worlds exist, but impossible do not. Like why? It's
Yeah, I mean, so of course I'm not neutral here, right? So I really do bring some metaphysical commitments to my view. My first probably question would be what makes such a difference between possibility and impossibility? Do we have a strong boundaries? What's possible is, what's impossible world, what possible is and what's impossible is. I don't think we have a straightforward answer to this, beside saying that look, possible is possible, impossible is impossible. Sure, but that's circular definition, right? So I don't think there is a fundamental difference between possibility and impossibility, because even if what is impossible in this world doesn't have to be impossible in another possible world. We don't travel from Vienna to New York in 1 minute in this world, but there is nothing contradictory to say that in some other world where the law of nature and
or public transport.
the degree of transportation is different, and there is a world where you can travel from Vienna to New York in 1 minute. There is nothing contradictory there. So that world is impossible because for us, But it's impossible. But it's not impossible simpliciter, because you can create a scenario where that's the case. So possibility and impossibility comes in degrees. Right?
Okay, I grant you that. But to return to my question and just shut me up if I'm being wrong. But from what I try to ask you, I maybe ask it again, maybe differently, maybe the same. I let the viewers to decide. Is that if I understood properly, a God is one of a possible world. God is not actual world. He is not in, or he, whatever the pronoun we shall use, is not in the actual world, or is not the actual world. He's not in the possible world. So by the way you presented it, he shall be even either an impossible world or all the things that are in impossible world. Maybe there are. I assume that there is not just one impossible world. Like why? Because as there is not just one way things could be, and different possible worlds are just like objects we posit in order to explain what are the differences between different ways how the world could be. There are also different possible, different ways how things could not even be. So there is probably more than just one impossible world. This is not like hard stretch. I'm just doing gymnastics here. And if that is so, there must be some kind of differences among impossible worlds. We have to be able to differentiate between them. And by the way, you say probably not all impossible worlds are like that. All impossibilities are true in them. So they have to be kind of different. And I assume that by what you state, it's just one of them. Maybe the maximal impossible world? Am I on a good plan here?
You're using the right term maximal, but I didn't say that God is a particular impossible world.
Okay.
Okay. So the second step in my argument is kind of inspired by a theory called pantheism.
Yeah.
Pantheism says that God is the nature, whatever the nature is.
Yeah, old guy Spinoza, my man.
Exactly. So I'm kind of borrowing this idea here, and I'm trying to wear this idea in a new dress. So I take just suppose for granted that you identify God with, along with pantheism, you identify God with the nature. Okay, suppose also that you accept possible worlds because they turn out to play some very, very useful theoretical role. Then, as a strong hardcore pantheist, you should not identify God with the actual world. You should identify God with all the possible worlds, right? Because you want God.
Okay, yeah.
You want God to exist. You want God to exist in every world, right? Because unless God exists in every world, well, there is something tricky, right? So you don't want to harm God's omnipresence as another complicated, great-making predicate. So you can stretch an extra mile and simply say God is the set of all possible worlds. Okay. But then
God is a set. That's hard to sell.
Or is a sum or collection. Yeah, this might be problematic, but speaking neutrally, let's suppose God is a collection of all possible worlds.
Okay, why not?
Now we said, look, but I just told you 5 minutes ago that we need impossible worlds as well, because impossible worlds have been introduced for the same purposes, so it would be ad hoc to identify God with the collection of all possible worlds and omit impossible worlds, right? So what the hardcore pantheists who accept impossible worlds might say, and I think that one way to look at it is, look, if you really want God to be omnipresent everywhere, you want God to be like everything, whatever everything is, what if God just were the collection of the actual world, possible worlds and impossible worlds? So this is the rough picture following the desiderata we require God to have. So I borrowed the idea of, let's call it now, modal pantheism, which simply identify God with with the collection of everything what there is, and if we agree that among things that there are impossible worlds, the God or God-like entity is a collection of all possible and impossible worlds.
But isn't there like a reduction? This feels to me like this should be in a contradiction with Cantor's theorem. Like, I don't know if you guys know it, like the statement that set of all subsets of a set is bigger than it's cardinal. The number of things in a set is smaller than the number of all the subsets of the set, like something like this. Maybe I'm being taken.
But it is set is also part of the.
Yeah, well, because all the things in the set are a subset of a set too. So this is a technical like set theory. Like there is not just one, there is many. But let me just fly as philosopher can fly over mathematics here. But if you use that argument that we need everything, got to be everything, so and we already on board with the claim that God is whatever that is kind of a set or collection, so we are on the grounds of some kind of set theory, naive or non-naive. So if you have God is not just set of possible worlds, but set of possible and impossible worlds, then if I'm using Cantor's theorem, there is some bigger set than this that contains this set and all its subset, and this doesn't have an upper bound. So if it doesn't have an upper bound, doesn't mean like the thought of some kind of modalist pantheism doesn't like presupposes something that doesn't exist, like the upper bound of potential of possible sets doable over possible and impossible world, or am I missing something somewhere, or this hasn't occurred in the debate yet?
Yeah, I mean, so importantly, I'm not talking about sets, right? So again, I mean, set theory combined with all those metaphysical commitment is problematic. That's why I don't want to talk about sets.
Smart move.
Just in order to avoid all the set theoretic paradoxes you have, right? So this is a proposal. I just leave on people to think what it is. Is it class? Probably class might be a better notion. But this is a kind of terminology. I'm providing a guide how to approach what you want from God to be. You want God to be everything. You want God to instantiate everything. You want God to be, doing all the stuff we expect Him to be. Here is the space I'm giving you. I'm giving you the space of possible and impossible world where every possibility is instantiated. That's what God does, or God-like entity does.
Like,
every impossibility is instantiated.
Like logical pantheist.
That's even like technical term. You can call it whatever you want, but this is kind of a guide what you might think about God-like entities. There is, I mean, nothing bigger. You can transcend it in some kind of I don't know, some internal stuff, contemplation or whatever. I'm not going into that debate. But if you ask me, what's the criteria of godlike entities? I'll tell you, is a collection of all possible and impossible worlds. Now, of course, you might raise the question, one of many questions, but the first one would be, look, but we want God to be personalized in a way, right? You're giving me a collection which is unpersonalized at all. And I do agree. I'm giving you a collection which is not personalized at all. And if you think that's not what God is, because God is person, I'm telling you, that's why I'm talking about God-like entity and not God. I'm just talking about entity which plays the God role. In history of religion, we have a definition of role, what the God is supposed to do. He's able to do everything. He knows everything. He can act without limits and so on.
He is everywhere. Also.
He is everywhere. Now,
but in a different kind of sense is like he is not everywhere like he is in the same place, but he is every place. Like the is means something different in the sentence
but
now.
that even plays for the thesis that to be means not to exist in a way as we exist, but to be is to, I don't know.
God is the stuff.
It's the stuff, right? And that's what pantheism says, right? So I don't think that idea might sound kind of ridiculous, but when you pose the question again, what plays the role of God? So we have a role of God which instantiates some great-making properties. Now the debate in philosophy room is what fills the role, what plays the role we associate with that. What's the role player? And I say, look, I'm giving you a candidate for role player of God's role, and that's the collection of all possible and impossible roles.
So then atheism by this is kind of wrong. Like, let me ask him, like, are you if you are putting a candidate, this assumes that the candidate is existing or is there, is at least a concise thought, coherent, consistent. Let's put it this way. And if all what you are claiming is true and consistent, which let's for the sake of argument here isn't it a straightforward consequence that atheists are wrong? They just need to study your book?
Well, if you follow the old argument according to which there must exist something something bigger we cannot conceive or whatever, yes. Now the question is how bad news it is for atheists.
Or atheists can say, no, that's not the God we are arguing about, or something like that?
Sure, then I can simply say, look, okay, your God is your concept of God is not my concept of God. There is no proper disagreement between us. I just gave you my story of what I understand by someone saying that there is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent entity. Again, entity in a very neutral sense, not spatio-temporally.
In this sense, are we getting back to this argument that we were having before?
Yeah.
If the theists and atheists are not missing each other, talking past each other, they are disagreeing.
Like this can be just nice chat between three pals who are kinda into this kind of things, but I try to, again, my back hemisphere, if there is a thing, is thinking about what's our scientific application of what we are doing here. And what Martin is saying has a consequences for the debate, and his consequences are like, guys, there is and girls or whatever, there is I give you a thing which you can try to analyze whether isn't this really what you are speaking about, and if it is, it can, and Martin described it to some degree of detail, and they will know, okay, don't use set theory here, okay, use this, don't use this, because he kind of shields his let's call it theory in a way that it's not that easily throwable out like he thought it before. So some of my questions were answered, let's put it this way. And he puts, let's say, an example of things for them to consider whether that is not what they are arguing about. And it's kind of and it's also a scientific explanation, like maybe I can use this thing, which plays godlike roles, whatever that is, and explain, this is why and what they are arguing about, and then we can go on from here to try to explain the disagreements. I don't think that he's necessarily, by positing this theory, it doesn't force him to explain atheism and atheism as misunderstanding each other, like talking past each other. I don't think so. Because, as I said last time, to explain this debate this way is the easy way out. It's it doesn't give proper value to all the history of, let's say, Western mankind. it's hard to tell that all those people were just misunderstanding each other. They were probably speaking about something. They tried to discuss something years and years and years. I don't know if it's this, but like, yeah, this is how it connects to the same question. Like, I don't think his theory, let's call it, or proto-theory, God theory, like his view, is forced to make this kind of conclusion. Like they talk past each other, or is it?
I mean, at this stage, again, let's go back to what really motivates the view, right? Because now we're at the end of the story. But again, what motivates the view? I just want to provide for a very fundamental attribute we associate with what we call God. That's my story. And if the conclusion is what we talk about, at the beginning, I mean, I don't know, but I'm very suspicious that the question at the beginning is just open question, which might lead to different accounts. And if those accounts are incompatible, if my account is incompatible with another account, okay, then we have to define where this disagreement arises. Right? Where is the disagreement? We all agree that we want God to be omnipotent, so that's where we agree. But what else? So I think there is an option to find the point where we just diverge, right, in a way. But
Okay, let me maybe put the question differently, or maybe not the same, but like move it a bit. But I mentioned it before, but I think that what you posit does exist, for the lack of a better term, is there. As soon as you are using modal logics, you use and posit possible worlds. Soon as you do, let's say, modern modal logic, you at least sometimes are forced to even consider impossible worlds. So and there are proper models of this. This is not like some guys thought. These are like formal theories based on the solid grounds. So you have those kind of things, and so it's not a question whether there is a set of possible worlds. It's not a question whether there is a set of possible worlds. This is kind of given, at least on a lot of theories, actually, formal theories. And therefore, it's not a question whether there is a set of which conjoins these two. So this is not up for content or up for debate. Let's say if as soon as you use modern modal logics, and please correct me if I'm wrong, then this is a consequence of your stance. This is, let's say, not a consequence, prerequisite or assumptions. And what's the tricky part of your theory is the claim, and this is God. Or this plays the God role. Like, so you don't have problem. For me, the biggest problem is not like whether the entity you are positing as an explanation is or isn't there, but whether this is the stuff. Am I like?
yeah, okay. So I might respond that, look, why we want God? Okay, why we talk about God? We want God to explain a huge metaphysical questions. Okay, we want to we want an explanation. Why is there something rather than nothing? This is a huge question people ask. And I say, my view can explain the question. Right? My view can respond to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? This question was usually asked in connection with God. Why is there something rather than nothing? And I can explain why is there something rather than nothing by talking about what I call God. So the entity I postulate can contribute to a question, which is a question about God, in an unusual sense.
Yeah, but why? Like, the question is why? Like, for what reason? So the consequence, if I'm just using substitutions in thinking, is that you are claiming now that you can explain why there is set of possible and impossible worlds. So if let's grade for the sake of argument that this is the God, just for the sake of argument, and this is something rather than nothing. Now the hard question: why that stuff exists? I granted you that it exists as soon as you do modal logics. Like it exists.
Yeah.
But the hard question is why? Why there is the set rather than there isn't?
Yeah, okay, this is a pragmatic response because it plays a theoretical role for our purposes.
Okay.
The existence of possible and impossible rules. Well, of course, okay. We doesn't have to press the point and say that possible world, the existence of possible worlds, and the existence of impossible world, is indispensable. We don't have to even this, but we can have a very strong pragmatic reason to think that possible world exists, not only because we want to explain the notion of God, but the introduction of possible worlds plays a very, very useful theoretical roles in other fields as well. So we have a reason to believe that there are impossible worlds. So I'm not providing an ontological argument for the existence of possible worlds.
You are proposing pragmatic one.
This is a very pragmatic one, but that's the same reason why we postulate sets, right? Because they play a very, very strong role in the explanation of various, even like non-abstract phenomena, right? So it's very useful to postulate sets because they provide us with an explanation of various different phenomena in the world. And this is the same. We can't see possible worlds, right? But if we postulate them, we shed light on many various phenomena and we provide an explanation. So this is a pragmatic reason why. And now, my view is that, look, I already have the actual world, possible worlds and impossible worlds. I already have them in my ontology, so I did commit to them.
Yeah, that's not auto move.
For other purposes. So now, look, if I have all those resources at hand, because of different reasons, why don't just use those resources to respond a serious question in history of philosophy, beside posing yet another entity which is transcendent, whatever. I have all the resources I have for explaining what it means to instantiate everything, because that space instantiates everything in different regions, sure, whatever region is, but it does instantiate everything. It is omnipresent everything, because partly, the sum is partly in every its part, right? So it's omnipresent in some way, whether that fulfills your intuitions about being present. Yeah, I don't know what it exactly means to be present, but
that seems like a book volume 2.
Yeah, but look, this is everything what we can see is present here, right? But in my view, this is part of a bigger region. This camera is part of city, which is part of a state, which is part of the actual world. The actual world is part of sum of possible world. The sum of possible worlds is sum of all worlds.
Look at how his hands are growing, like almost preaching.
So omnipresence in this way is explained. Omnipotence, is it explained? Partly yes, partly no.
Good.
But that's the reason. I'm just using resources I did commit myself already to.
You are doing what philosophers always done, besides dying, is like trying to use the tools they have to explain the stuff they have to their lives.
That's called Occam's razor. Right? I don't pose anything if I don't need pose it, right? And I have resources to explain God talk, so why should I go beyond my already accepted?
Okay, that's like your ambition, like assumption that you have. Like, let's see, I'm waiting for the book or series of books. Let me pose maybe not final, but maybe one of the questions that's really interesting. Like, let's grant you your theory. Let's say that it is not like it's your theory. Is the statement God exists necessarily true?
I've got a view on this, of course. It exists in every world, right? it or he does not exist wholly in one world, right? So it exists, full stop.
So some world is just God's knee, some.
If you personalize God,
Yeah.
I don't personalize God. So he exists in a way that he has part in every world, because every world is its part, right? So in that sense of necessary existence, he necessarily exists. How interesting that notion of necessity is.
If he does not exist wholly in each of the possible worlds, then there can the question be asked, like, does he manifest himself, itself, herself somewhere by simply not being there? Does the manifestation of God is in some of the worlds possible or impossible, simply not being present?
So that would be world which does not have a God in it, or
One of the impossible ones.
that would be an impossible world. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I've got a view on this as well, right?
Please.
You came prepared.
So this world exists. Right?
Okay.
Such a world where there is no God, it exists. But what it means to not exist in that world, right? I think that to exist is always kind of relative to a domain, right? So kind of a meaningful account of existence is always restricted to some domain. So if you quantify over stuff in that impossible world, he does not exist. But I think it's still consistent with saying that world is a part of God.
Yeah, you are quantifying you are quantifying over different things then.
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, I don't think there's an ad hoc answer here, because we do this. We don't have to go into the domain of impossible worlds. We do this when I say there is no beer, and I open the fridge. It's true, there is no beer, but I'm not saying there is no beer somewhere else. I'm just hiddenly saying that there is no beer in the fridge. I don't have to say in the fridge. I just open. It's pragmatic one. I just open the fridge and say there is no beer, but I'm not claiming there is no beer internally. There is no beer when I restricted it.
But imagine those breaking news, CNN. There's no beer, and then imagine the consequences.
There is no internet anymore.
So yeah, that would be. But yeah, I mean, of course, you can go through like extreme cases now, right? How you can test what I can do with the view and what I cannot do with the view. But then I can challenge the intuitions then. I mean,
My another question would be, what does your argument contribute to the whole discussion about divine names, like the name Miloš,
They are not names of individuals that I can tell you by what he suggested. Like the semantics, if that is actually, because Martin didn't want to say that he needs to provide all the technical consequences. He's just providing, how he calls, a view that can all his PhD students try to provide technical details of, but it will be hard. It will say they are not probably names as Irakli, Miloš, or Martin, because or are they? Because there are some sets. I don't know, just to grab the old friend of the theory here. Like there are some particular sets that have name. They are so important. Like you have empty set, and there is just one.
yeah.
Like, and if I don't know if it's called empty with big A, but it's the empty, and I can call it now. It's like my big E, or something like this. So, am I on the correct flight here with you? Like the semantics will be different with the names then.
Yeah, I mean that semantics might become messy, right? But yeah, I don't know. I don't have a story about semantics here, right? So different what we usually call different gods, like Zeus or whatever. They just exist, but they are not. They don't play the God role I attribute to God role, right? So,
Okay, so we are now in a quick fire round. Can I fire another?
Yeah.
Okay, so after careful 2 seconds of consideration, I think that it seems to me that what you are proposing is in contradiction with polytheistic religions. So if what you say is true, they are wrong, or
Um,
like
well, I grant you, I find place in my ontology for what they call gods. I just grant you the place in my model space for those entities. They are not God they don't play the God role which I attribute with the God role. So yes, yes.
okay, so you can say okay, there's maybe as the story goes, usually there's like biggest god and a bunch of gods and then God's friends or something like that. So you as we mentioned, you have this set of possible worlds and impossible worlds, and you have its subsets.
Yeah.
So there can be some kind of you are god of this kind of impossibilities, and you are kind of like you can play with this.
I mean, even people I'm really messing up with intuitions, but even people like in polytheistic orientation don't want God to be trivial object. I mean, they want these entities exist, right? But they don't want them to do everything full stop, like to be explosive objects. So I don't have to I can call them God star, but yeah, as you mentioned, I can give you, my ontology gives you an explanation that it exists. If it's possible or not, I don't know. It's up to how you fragment model space, but yeah, but it's less and less talk about God and more talk about God-like entity. Yeah. With entity very broadly construed, what entity is.
Okay, but it's still you are not saying that you are giving the truth. You are giving a solution to consider.
Yeah, I mean that's the way how I think about entity which we usually associate with God. That's the what the entity should be able to to represent when we talk about God. But again, I'm messing with intuitions, and because we don't have strong intuitions here. Right?
None of three of us actually.
Yeah,
We've been going strong, and maybe we should be nearing the finishing line now. So maybe you have some final thoughts that Martin then can, I don't know, address, comment on.
Oh, I actually was firing on him left, right, and center. Like this was nice 12 rounds of. It was actually quite nice. I can see this. I don't know if it would be nice if written on a paper, but I'm happy that you said that this is actually something you worked on a lot. It can be seen. I'm happy. I'm looking forward for the book. Does it have a name yet? Do you know where it comes out?
It's probably not mentioning God in the title. But,
That's a good title.
good title. I think it's taken, but.
Okay, so I think that we can wrap this up. We heard a lot. I have to go home to my dark place and digest this. But I don't. Yeah, thank you for coming and thank you for sharing the theory.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Martin, very much. The notion of impossible worlds and this collection really made me to think about some stuff. So also very looking forward for your book. It will be very interesting. I'm absolutely sure. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's
Wonderful. And this we say goodbye, and maybe we'll be continuing with another episode sometime soon. No.